met me, I'm Crystal Powers. I work at the Nebraska Water Center as well as the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute and Nebraska Extension. So all those hats to talk about water in Nebraska. Welcome to the afternoon session. I really hope you had a great time on the tours. We had beautiful weather, so even though we didn't get out to the park last night, I know I enjoyed being out in the beautiful morning. Today's slate of speakers, we're going to kind of have a couple keynote speakers and then kind of a keynote panel to round out the day. And we really are trying to kind of look forward today in our planning. So we're going to kick off, well, before I kick off the speaker, 2 housekeeping pieces. They are doing the national phone emergency test here at like 1:20 something. So try to maybe turn off your phones so we don't have 70 phones shrieking at us here in a few minutes. And then these sessions are also available for continuing education unit. So if you need any of those, make sure and sign the sheet at the back of the room and we'll make sure you get credit for those. So with that, I want to introduce our first speaker of the afternoon is Steve Owen with the City of Lincoln. You met him some yesterday, but we're here to have him kind of do a deeper dive into Lincoln's Water 2.0 project. With that, let's welcome Steve.
I'm going to be down here in front because I need to keep my eyes on the slides. If I start kind of sounding like a rapper with the microphone, please let me know. And as far as the emergency notice, if that does happen, not a huge deal. I know some of you are certainly engaged in emergency response, so if you want to see what that looks like and feel what it sounds like, I'm fine with that, taking a little bit of a pause here at 1:20. So I'm here today to talk about Lincoln's Water 2.0 project. This is all about how Lincoln is going to supply water to the masses really into the future. And so I like to start off with a little bit of history, and then I'll set this up by talking a little bit about our planning process. How do we come up with the amount of water that is projected that we need to serve our customers? And then I'll end up with really the process that we went through to get to a kind of a tentative decision. So I warned somebody after lunch I was going to start off with the first slide talking about influenza, stomach illness, and those kinds of things. Maybe that's not a way to start an afternoon session. But really our history started in Lincoln in 1876. So that's when we municipalized the water system, and we used a series of wells. These wells were kind of cistern-type wells, very large diameter, dug down into the ground, bricked up, pumps were put in them, and then water was pumped, no treatment, water was pumped out to our customers. And there's 2 incidences in history of some pretty serious outbreaks of typhoid fever, what was termed typhoid fever back in the day. And this was an excerpt out of one of the reports that talked about one of those incidences. And it's interesting how they describe it: a sudden and explosive outbreak of more or less severe intestinal disease. And what we learned was that, and it's going to be hard to see here. So this is a diagram of the well, and this is a sewer line that went past the well. And because of some heavy rain events and a broken sewer main, there was sewage that then went into this rice well, and that's what really caused the sickness. But we supplied Lincoln with wells throughout the city through about 1932. And then we started, or our forefathers and foremothers back in that time, realized that as the city is growing, the water quality and the water quantity in the basically the Salt Valley Creek area was just not sufficient. Capacity or supply was not sufficient, and the water quality was very poor. So a lot of these wells were in the Dakota Aquifer, so high dissolved solids, salt, and folks just came to realize that that wasn't going to be a sufficient supply for the city of Lincoln. And what I found interesting in both of these these examples of our early days of supplying water was EPA wasn't around. The public water supply industry had really had not evolved by that time. And this was all university people that were weighing in on, is there enough capacity? What is the water quality? How do we track down people getting sick? And so all of this was really coming out of the university at the time. And if you go back to, if you kind of remember this list of potential water sources that were being tossed around back in the late 1920s and early 1930s, this list sort of looks similar to the list that I'm going to talk about that we went through with our Water 2.0 project. The point is that there are lots of different water sources, and some of those are questionable quality, and some of those water sources just simply don't have the capacity. So it's interesting that essentially 100 years ago, we were looking at what the next source of water was going to be for the city of Lincoln. We're doing that now as we speak. This is an example of a train load of 36-inch pipe once we decided to move to Ashland and develop that supply along the Platte River. This was a load of pipe, 36-inch pipe, and that's what really joined the city of Lincoln to the Ashland well field, Platte River well field. That pipe is still in service today, runs down the shoulder of Highway 6 for the most part, goes down into our A Street reservoir system, provides good service for us today. What's really interesting is that pipe was laid in less than a year. And I think most of us in this room would agree that that's almost an impossible feat in today's world of permitting and supply chain issues and those kinds of things. So things were fairly good. When we developed that well field, we started to send water from the well field down to Lincoln. But we noticed, or our customers noticed, that the water was turbid. And complaints started coming in. We did no filtration and no treatment originally when we developed that well field. So it was pretty obvious that we needed to do something to remove iron and manganese. And there's parts of this early plant that was built in 1932 that are still in service today. In fact, we've got a project right now to get into some of those original filters and take a look at the understructure of the filter to see if that structure is still sound. But the filter media that was put in the late 19 or the early 1930s is still in service today and giving very good performance in terms of iron and manganese removal. So a little bit about water use trends. I think several of us talked a little bit about this in some sessions yesterday. A lot of folks don't realize that per capita water use has really declined. And this is not unique to Lincoln. MUD would have this same trend. And this is a trend that you see across the country. In fact, I think Doug referred yesterday, Doug Whitfield made mention to one of the effects of declining water use is revenue. So it's always a hard message to go out and promote water conservation with your customers, and what's happening in the background is declining revenues. This hasn't really hit Lincoln Water so much, but there are water utilities, especially out west, who have really had to grapple with this issue. So you charge by a gallon of water, and if your customers are using less water, you've got all these fixed costs associated with your facilities, the rates go up. So we've gone from in the early 1970s to 200 gallons per day per capita to 132 in present day. And this is total water use. So this is all the water use, commercial, residential, industrial, divided by the population. And about 65% of this is used at the home. So when you splash some other trends across this, what's really telling is as population has increased, For Lincoln, a little over 1% a year population increase. With this trend of declining per capita water use, it's very telling that our average day water use has remained flat during that same period of time. This chart takes a little bit to get your eyes around, but what this tries to demonstrate is really the same concept, but specifically looking at dry years. Dry years means higher water use. And we talked at length yesterday about, especially in the urban environment, seasonal water use and customers using outdoor water use, principally for turf irrigation. And it's interesting that even in times of dry periods, our per capita water use has declined. And you might ask why. Probably, and I think mostly, just an awareness that our customers have on the value of the resource. There's been certainly some technology. I always say, love them or hate them on automatic irrigation systems, but if an automatic irrigation system is maintained properly, they can actually efficiently apply water to turf. So there might be a little of that going on also. So our historical water shortage events, and this is really what's driving us to how much water do we need. Like it or not, our customers are the ones that decide how much water they're going to use. We can influence that a little bit with rates. I talked yesterday about Lincoln's water conservation rate, or as Rick Kubat explained it, it's an increasing block rate structure. So in our residential rates, there are 3 blocks of rates. The first block is the cheapest, and it's intended to really target indoor water use. I don't see anybody rushing out. It does work, yeah. I'm glad we all got to experience that. That's great. Yeah, so it's really this idea of summer or seasonal water use. That's what drives the need to have enough water, source water. There are other things that drive our facilities. Peak hour use is mostly tied to water storage in our distribution systems. Daily is more about pumping and transmission, but the seasonal water use is what drives our need to make sure that we have enough source water supply. And it's really June, July, and August. Sometimes it's July, August, and September. It just depends on really those 3 months and temperatures and humidity. So these are our water storage events that Lincoln has gone through, as best that I can tell, in history. Another excerpt that came out of some material back in 1952, it seems like that was a tough year. Obviously dealing with some droughts. On June 12th, the water consumption in Lincoln was 34 million gallons a day. And we only had the capacity to provide 30 million. So you do the math, we were short on water supply. And it talks about, look at the first thing on the list, lawns were without water. Wow. Isn't that something? Air conditioning systems were turned off, pressures in the mains were far below normal. That can actually be a problem, a health problem. You do not want your distribution system to depressurize because you can pull in contaminants to the system. So that's a big deal. And the city was without adequate fire and public health protection. So, Lincoln's been dealing with these water shortages from time to time. It's those water shortages that then drive us to be thinking about where is the next source of water, or what increment of supply do we need to develop. So this is what's really driven, since 1932, what's really driven us to continue to develop our Platte River well field near Ashland. Down below are some, in blue there are the 3 years that we were significantly impacted with floods. So it's not just droughts that impact our ability to serve, but certainly flooding in the Platte River. And of course, a lot of people in this room experienced the event in 2019. Um, I think today we're probably around 3,000 CFS in the river. The peak in 2019 was over 200,000 CFS that came down the river. It was a historic event. And again, many of you were involved in that. It really took us to our knees. We had to go into emergency mandatory water conservation efforts. Um, Power was a huge thing for us. You have to have power to run these facilities and your pumps and your treatment systems. We had damage to a couple of large collector wells, so it really, really impacted us significantly. Again, another reminder about redundancy. So that'll be kind of the theme later on in this presentation. Yesterday I showed the slide about the article that was in the Huffington Post from some research that came out of the University of Florida talking about Lincoln being third on the list nationally to have a significant water shortage. And I mentioned that I'm not sure that the research was sound, but the premise was the Platte River goes dry. I mean, the Platte River disconnects itself in a lot of dry years, kind of around that Grand Island area. So if your water source is the Platte River, I can see how you can come to that conclusion. So here's just some pictures. That was July of 2012, about 500 CFS. In 2012, the river got down to right around 200 CFS. And I think that was a historic low for the river. It lasted probably in that area, lasted about a month. And so in 2012 was the last time that Lincoln enacted mandatory conservation efforts. And our mandatory conservation efforts are essentially designated day watering. Again, trying to target turf irrigation. There was some information yesterday at the last session from County Extension that talked about 30 to 40% of water is used in turf irrigation. I would say that on a hot summer day, extended dryness, that you could be over 50% of the water that we're producing and sending to Lincoln is used for turf irrigation. Very significant. So here's the flood event. Again, the photo shows the 2019 event, and it was just a vast amount of water that came down the system. And I think for those of you that were involved would agree that it just kept coming. And so it just never stopped. And the peak was a long-lived peak. It prevented us from getting out to our facilities. In fact, we had to mobilize the Air National Guard to actually go out, fly out folks out to our well fields to operate valves, get our wells back operating. So it was quite an event. We spent probably a week of flying in helicopters operating our system and airboats. And in 1993, we were in the process of putting in a large transmission main, a second transmission main out to our well field. That got taken out. So these events are very, very significant and can certainly cause water shortages. So how do we kind of figure this all out, and how do we determine what our customers are using? It's a bit of a crystal ball. We of course look a lot at history to guide us, and we do a lot of master planning. So every 5 years we're developing a master plan that really looks at the system soup to nuts. And one of the things that we're looking at is that whole supply and demand curve. How much supply do we have, and what do we think our customers are going to use? And when those two lines come together, it's not hard math. When those two lines come together, you have a potential shortage. So that's what this chart is really showing. This comes out of our 2020 master plan. That green line, again, is that seasonal peak. So it's that amount that we believe our customers are going to use in that June, July, August, September timeframe. There is some nuances to that line. In our 2020 master plan was the first attempt that we did to try to reflect climate change and look at some of the climate prediction models that are essentially saying higher temperatures. And, and we have attempted to work that in on both the supply and demand side of things. And I've got another slide that'll kind of explain that a little bit better. But this would suggest that we've got, within our Ashland well field, we believe we've got the capacity for 2 additional collector wells. Now, these collector wells are big wells. So a lot of you are familiar with a typical irrigation or a vertical well. These are very large diameter wells, 16 to 20 feet in diameter. Lateral well screen is projected out at the bottom of the well. They're very efficient wells. You can draw them down quite a way. So they're high capacity wells. These wells, with good river conditions, these wells can produce 15, close to 20 million gallons a day. During low river conditions, maybe in that 10 to 12 million gallons a day. So we believe that we can continue to develop the Ashland well field up through about 2050. And that would be then when we would need another source of supply. Well, obviously, developing new sources of water supply don't come easy. It takes a lot of time to put that together, and that is why we're currently working on this. So this is an example of how making these adjustments for climate change using these climate prediction models can really influence a number, so to speak. And this is on the supply side. So if we use the historical database and we look at the time interval for these events, you can calculate a probability that they may occur in the next planning period. So we're looking at a 40-year planning period. And the reoccurrence interval on these events can then be used to determine what the probability that the event may occur. So this particular event is a 90-day event. So where the average stream flow would be 1,500 CFS, 700 CFS, and 200 CFS. And if we use the historical data to do the evaluation, that's the probability that those events may occur. Again, 90 days of the river being at 700 CFS or less. And the reason we chose 700 is that's our in-stream flow rate. So when the river begins to get in that 700 CFS range or below, that could be a point where Lincoln exercises its right to that amount of water in the stream. Not something we've done, but it's sort of a tool that's in the tool bag for us. But when we look at climate change and we make the adjustments, you can see how the probabilities are affected. And what's interesting is in that 200 CFS, historically we've not seen 200 CFS in the Platte River for a 90-day stretch. So the percentage is essentially nothing. The probability of that happening is essentially zero. But as we start to put in this idea of climate change into the model, you can see that there becomes a chance that the river gets down to that level for that long a period of time. That's pretty significant. Would be very significant for us. Another thing we did is a little bit of checking our peers. This information comes out of an AWWA, so the American Water Works Association. They survey water and wastewater utilities across the country. And this is a good metric when you're comparing to other utilities in terms of what is their supply? How long will their current supply last? And the median of those surveys came in about 50 years. And you can see that Lincoln, again, using that 2048, 2050 time frame, Lincoln is in the kind of the bottom 25th percentile of those surveyed utilities. So a way to maybe check against our peers. Are we headed in the right direction? Perhaps we're a little behind. Okay, so that's kind of the setup, a little bit of the history of the utility and how we plan and how we make projections for what our customers are going to use, and the performance of our current well field. So, knowing all this, we've been talking about a second source of water supply for several years. It's not really new in our vocabulary, but it was certainly time to pull the trigger. And Mayor Gaylord Baird had the foresight to say, you know what, this is something that my administration is going to start working on. And she commissioned a water source advisory council of a really diverse range of folks with diverse backgrounds. This is a great example of what I like to refer to as diversity of thought. And when we first developed this group, I thought, oh boy, how's this going to work? How do we get all these people in a room, talk about very technical issues, and make decisions? And the schedule on this was we commissioned this group back in June of 2022. And the charge was to help guide a recommendation for a second water source no later than February of 2023. And I went, wow, how are we going to do that? So we put this group together and began developing a very objective, very rigorous process that this group would use to come to that decision. And here we have Dr. Ray. We could play Where's Waldo? We could all try to pick out where Dr. Ray sits. Dr. Ray is on the lower right. But we had this group really bookend with a technical group. So Dr. Ray, yourself, Jerry Obrist, who has a lot of experience with the Lincoln Water System, Glenn Johnson, former general manager of Lower Platte South, NRD. You know, they were kind of the technical team. Then we had several elected officials, Senator Bostard, Senator Wishart, and Councilman Beckius and McGinnis, and Lancaster County Commissioner Flowerday. And so they were there to really learn about the system, because they're going to have to go back to their constituents and message this. Here's what we decided. There could be rate impacts associated with this. Here's why it's important we move on this so quickly. So that was really their mission. And they helped us really come up with how do we do this messaging and what's important to their constituents. And then in between, we had a very diverse range of different backgrounds. Andrew Dunkley, representing Farm Bureau and representing ag interests. And you might think, well, this is an urban problem. Why would you have that stakeholder on your committee? Well, you know, we're talking about if we ever have to exercise our in-stream flow right of 700 CFS, that's going to affect upstream ag producers. So we wanted to hear and have that representation on this advisory committee. And Dr. Ray, everybody got along, right? So this was the design criteria that the advisory committee sort of worked with. We wanted a supply source that took us out to the year of 2075, a seasonal capacity of 145 MGD, a maximum day capacity of 175 MGD. But we wanted to provide redundancy. That was a real key component to this. It looked at these low flow events on the Platte River. We included climate impacts into the supply and demand projections. And one thing to keep in mind, our Water 2.0, the comprehensive project itself, anticipates building out full development of the Ashland well field capacity, which also includes treatment upgrades so that we can treat this additional water that would be coming out of the Platte River well field, and we'd be targeting arsenic and manganese removal. So this is really the kind of the Water 2.0 scope and design criteria. So the activities that the Water Source Advisory Council went through, and by the way, we had a long debate on do we call them a council or the committee. And we ended up with council, and unfortunately, whenever you say council, you begin to think, well, the city council was involved in this. We had representatives from the city council, but this was an entirely separate group of people. The first order of business was to develop factors. What was important to each of the stakeholders that were on that committee as they think about their constituents and the people that they would have to go out and educate and talk to on this whole concept of developing additional supply for the city of Lincoln. And within 2 meetings, this group were able to define in these factors or criteria what was important to them and what we wanted to evaluate with these different alternatives. We wanted them to consider the universe of alternatives. We didn't want somebody to say, well, why didn't you look at this source of water? How come you didn't consider that? And so we initially looked at 14 different sources of water. And we did an initial feasibility evaluation on all those alternatives and eventually kicked out 7. That second bullet, consider water supply enhancements. So I think initially there was some thoughts with the group that, well, can we conserve our way out of this? Can we just do more water conservation? And the answer to that was clearly no. You're not going to conserve your way out of this, but you can certainly, any additional sources you add, water conservation is going to be a key component of increasing the life of that particular capacity. Also the life of our current Platte River well field. So water conservation was not an alternative on its own, but certainly part of the program. Aquifer storage was another one of those supply enhancements. Realized that technology is something that's worth looking at, but it certainly wouldn't solve our problem to get us down to 2,075 and 145 MGD capacity. And then finally, really sit down and hammer out this short list of alternatives and make a recommendation to the mayor. That was the charge statement. So this is a list of the factors that were used and that the committee came up with. Really, staff and our consultant who facilitated this, we sort of stayed out of the mix. Our director and assistant director were representatives on the council, but we really stayed out of the mix. And at times that was difficult because we had our own opinions. We, of course, know the business, but we found a way to just kind of sit back, provide facts, provide figures to the group, and let them sort of sort through all of these different factors. And we even had sub-factors under those main ones that the council worked through. So every month we would have a meeting and we would cover 2 or 3 of these different factors. And we would actually then have the council rank them. So it was a very objective process, and I'll show you some examples here in a minute. So this was the kind of the universe of alternatives. I had mentioned earlier with that first or second slide that, that list that you saw there, kind of stacks up to some of these alternatives. There is water out there. There is water that's near Lincoln, mostly groundwater sources, but the capacity of those sources is just not sufficient, again, to meet that design criteria that we were trying to meet. Water quality, sometimes questionable. So in really one meeting, as we went through each of these and talked about them from a technical aspect, within one meeting, the council got to this short list of seven of these alternatives to look at further. So expand the existing well field, our Platte River well field. Look at off-channel surface water reservoir, which was mainly storage. So that's simply during winter periods or off-peak, we would be taking water from our existing Platte River well field, developing a storage reservoir, and then using that water the next season. So, that definitely can be done, has been done, but in the end didn't rank so high. This interconnection with MUD, that's been long discussed. We have talked to MUD for several years about how that might work, and so that was certainly on the list to look at. And of course, it doesn't take long to find yourself looking at the Missouri River for the next source. And so we had 4 alternatives along the Missouri River. 2 of those alternatives took water from the Missouri River, took it up to our Ashland facilities, and then back down through our existing transmission to Lincoln. Of course, the issue there is redundancy. We're still relying on a portion of our facilities to make that happen. 2 of them then along the Missouri River was to treat at the river and then deliver treated water back to Lincoln. And in each of those groups, we looked at a surface water intake versus a well field. So those were the 7 alternatives that that the council worked through. This is just a couple of examples of how these were scored. So at the end of the discussion, where we would present again on a factual basis the information that kind of underpin these factors, the council would then rank using what they believed was important, again, thinking about their constituents, thinking about their expertise in their particular area, their experiences, rank each of these factors. So here's an example of the operations criteria. How easy or difficult were these sources to operate? This one was a little hard for me to stand back, but it's interesting. You can kind of see, for those of you that are knowledgeable of what it takes to operate a surface water system versus a well field system, something that has an open reservoir on it, you can kind of see the council did sort of line up as you would kind of see that happening. So you can see that the surface water, both the surface water intakes on the Missouri River ranked low. That off-channel reservoir that I mentioned kind of ranked low. You know, anytime you're dealing with surface water, it's a whole new set of regulations that you have to abide by. Here's a governance group, and I asked our MUD friends yesterday if they were opposed to me showing this, but this really got at an idea that was pretty apparent, that Lincoln and this group representing Lincoln were very keen on making sure Lincoln maintained its autonomy, that we were not beholden by contract on a supply of water. Now, in the public water supply business, that isn't necessarily how it works. I think there are examples. Matter of fact, there was an example, I think, down in Arizona recently, where the public water supplier turned the valve off to a small group of folks that, by contract, were being supplied water. But that doesn't normally happen, but it can happen. And then you have a whole rate side of it. How would Lincoln ratepayers be represented through this connection with MUD? Well, you can kind of see how they lined up. The group lined up. They were concerned about the whole idea of autonomy and control. And so these alternatives going to the Missouri River, having control of our system, really then ranked high in the group's mind. So this is an example of the final scoring. The different 7 factors might be a little hard to read, but you know, we're starting to see where alternative H, which is going to the Missouri River, developing a well field, and treating water at the source, bringing it back to Lincoln, begins to start to take some traction. You can kind of look at this as a cost benefit. It certainly doesn't meet up with the definition of a cost benefit, but this is really what that ranking number begins to show. How favorable are these different alternatives? So you throw cost on there, so that's the white dot. For those of you in the back of the room, you know, these are in millions of dollars. So we're talking about the MUD interconnection, 1.39 billion. The alternative H, which is again Missouri River, well field and treatment, about 1.39 billion. You might ask, well, how come the MUD option was of that cost? Well, they have to do a lot of improvements to their system, and again, we want to make sure that that connection is reliable. So they did a lot of engineering work on their system to come to a cost on what they would have to do. And of course, we're going to bear the cost of that through some type of an agreement. They have to do a lot of improvements to their system. So the recommended alternative then that was forwarded to Mayor was this alternative H. It was um, one of the more costly alternatives, but it certainly was of high benefit, high value to the council members. And this just mirrors some of the notes. You couldn't read those, but this is really what they came up with when you would ask maybe the council collectively, hey, summarize and explain why you felt this alternative H made sense. It's fully redundant. So you're not using facilities that are already in our system. It's a fully redundant system. So, when you're thinking about 2019 flood event coming down the Platte River, there are chances that not both of your supply sources will be interrupted. Now, I know there's some of you in the room that said, wow, were you at the Missouri River in 2019? There was a lot of damage and a lot of water coming down the river then. The idea is that these collector wells that I mentioned really are pretty stout. They are founded on bedrock. They can be constructed in the floodway. The problem is you got to make sure they continue to be powered, and you have to have a way to get to them. And those can be all sort of designed in. So ease of implementation and minimal water supply permitting, we believe that's the case. Of course, nothing is going to be without permitting, but we believe that that alternative offers that. And again, that third bullet we just talked about, it maintains the city's autonomy. And also allows us to maybe consider regionalizing and providing and dropping off finished water to others along the way. That was, I didn't show that factor, but that was another factor that was considered and really got this alternative H moved up. Our ability to provide regional supplies. And certainly provides capacity beyond 2075. So here's conceptually what we're doing with this alternative H. Once the recommendation was accepted by the mayor, we moved immediately into a validation phase. So again, this is all conceptual at this point, but we're now validating and making sure there aren't any fatal flaws with this concept. So we're looking at pipeline alignments. We're down drilling as we speak along the river and doing aquifer testing and hydrogeologic investigations. So it's go time for us. Here we are down at the river. This was probably 2 months ago. So our next steps, we're going to continue the validation, make sure that this alternative can be advanced from a technical standpoint. There's a huge cost component in this. Also, we're looking at where will the X mark the spot for the well field and for the treatment facility. Looking at conveyance back to Lincoln, those are significant steps to develop. And always remind folks that the Water 2.0 project involves continued build out of the Platte River well field and upgrading our treatment facilities. And we are already beginning design on the first leg of transmission that will join the two water sources up. So this would be a transmission main, for those of you that are familiar with Lincoln, along the 98th Street corridor. So once that transmission main gets constructed here in the next couple of years, there literally is a T in the line that would be for the Missouri River water source. So we can get water going both ways. We were fortunate to have Senator Bostar and Senator Wishart get us or develop kind of a path forward with funding. And so in the two legislative years, 2022 and 2023, we've been the benefactor of about $197 million to get this work done. These funds are significant. They do have deadlines associated with them, but the point is we're confident we can get this done. We've got several engineering contracts, and work has already started in earnest on all of these projects. So, yeah, I think that's all I had. I think we've got maybe 7 minutes for questions. Thank you.
Great presentation.
Thanks.
Has there been any? I know MUD talked about, Plattsmouth comes to mind as a city out there with the aging infrastructure and really struggling with their water system. So, was there any discussion as part of this as to where maybe Lincoln system could help with some of those older systems that are out there?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jim, and that was of high value to the advisory council. Our ability to serve some other folks along the way, and Plattsmouth came up, Nebraska City came up. Just pick any of those communities sort of along the way. So yes, and then that makes it more credible that we're using state funding, hopefully now and in the future. To serve those communities. This isn't just a Lincoln thing, for sure. Now, are we gonna have those communities served anytime soon? No, it's gonna take a while.
And then as a follow-up, the lowest cost alternative was expansion of the Ashland, and then what was there? And maybe I think you answered this, is that there is more capacity to do some work with the wells at Ashland. Did I get that right? So is the thought process to where we're going to do the low cost upgrades to Ashland that we can, and do the project to the Missouri River, or how was that kind of thought through?
Yeah, so certainly building out full capacity of our Ashland well fields is part of this, in combination with going to the Missouri River. That other alternative was further expanding our footprint to the south. And the problem with that alternative is, well, you're still tied to the same source of water. So that really ranked low when it came to the redundancy side of things. And every day changes. We're constantly looking at our model, using data that is coming in. 2023 was another somewhat of a low flow event here in the later months of the year. We've had some change in the river near our well fields. So the city of Lincoln owns an island, and we've got 3 of these collector wells on the island. Unfortunately, it's not an island anymore. So the east channel has changed. The east channel has kind of dried up. We think that the 2019 flood event was a culprit in that. And so that does change our groundwater modeling, and does change our capacity. And so we're constantly kind of, the numbers change from day to day. But no, the idea is that we get as much water out of our current footprint as we can at the same time that we're developing this Missouri River well field. Not to say that we might look at expanding the footprint going across the river, but not as the total answer. Any other questions? Yes.
What does the regulatory approval timeline look like for this project?
Oh man, that's a great question. Devil's in the details. There's no doubt about that. We recognize that there will be some significant permitting. We've been able to go down, we've been able to do our hydrogeologic work and get through the permitting. Long-eared bats are a big part of us being able to go down and do the hydrogeologic study. You wouldn't think that, but we had to be very careful about tree removals and timing and that kind of thing. Small example of permitting. So I'm being vague on answering the question. I wish I knew, but the idea is that with effort and expense, we'll be able to get through the permitting side of it.
Thanks, Steve. This is Melissa. I'm on the Lower Platte South Entity Board for Subdistrict 3. I had the same question, so thank you for asking. I remember discussing during some of the climate action plan stuff that this was maybe we wanted to have this project done within 20 years. So a follow-up question to that timeline is, do you think that that 20-year mark is going to be achievable? That was one of my questions. So.
Yeah, I really do. But we have to get on with it for sure. Mm-hmm. The fact that we've been infused with this $200 million, talk about a shot in the arm. That's really what we needed to move this along. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. My follow-up question is regarding water quality. What types of things are we going to be doing with the treatment facility, and what are we looking at as far as improving water quality? Some new things maybe with technology, or what are we looking at for that? And then as a piece of that, will these new wells have wellhead protection on them? I think that was one of the concerns I had when I saw those wells in 2019 with the sandbags going around them and just being nervous about that. So will those wells have that protection?
Yeah, so we certainly haven't gotten into the design of the actual wells. These wells can experience flooding. They're properly constructed with seals, properly constructed with seals on the top, and in fact, raised. Our last two wells were raised above the 500-year flood event. So the idea is that you will not have flood waters in your well house or on top of your well. You'll have it around it, for sure, but that's where you do a well seal. We are just in the stages of collecting groundwater samples from our hydrogeologic studies. So that's going to tell us a lot about what kind of water we're dealing with. I asked the question, are we going to be looking at PFAS? Everybody's heard, well, not everybody, but those in the business have heard about PFAS lately. So yeah, we're going to be looking at all of that. I had mentioned that the improvements that we're doing to our Ashland facilities are going to look primarily at arsenic and further manganese removal. And so the Ashland plant is a direct filtration plant. And there are some limitations with direct filtration, but we've been able to provide very high water quality. But we have seen a trend with higher manganese levels. We know we're going to have higher manganese levels as we put additional collector wells in. So we recognize that we're going to have to probably move away from a direct filtration plant. I shouldn't say move away from it. We're going to have to add coagulant and sedimentation probably ahead of our filters. So that's what we're looking at right now. But we've got a pilot plant set up. We're evaluating the data that's coming off that. So that'll be, and again, part of this whole Water 2.0 and increasing supply capacity. Don't know if I answered the question, but okay.
Thank you. Well, I think we've used up all of our time. I know we've got a couple other questions here we didn't get to. Are you going to be here at the break still? All right. Maybe catch Steve here at the break. Let's thank him again.